You'll be able to get into it, I think. By seizing every opportunity to work overtime, by keeping to myself and following my own display ideas, I achieved some notoriety. My window decorations began to appear in the evening papers, but I merely began to work harder and spent all my lunch hours at home. I went to hear V, the celebrated designer, speak on the future of men's fashions at a buyers' meeting. A wealthy and powerful family had secured her position in the world of fashion, and she'd risen to control a whole line of evening wear. During her speech, I became nauseous and dizzy and went into the unattended cloakroom. It was dark, for the only source of light, an illuminated wall clock, had been covered by a coat. Probably a coat placed by a woman who was standing there in darkness. Or perhaps she'd followed me. Noticing my alarm, she smiled faintly, or rather, I thought she did, since there was barely enough light to see. Then she chatted without encouragement in cordial tones. She was the daughter of the speaker and was also a designer of gloves. Presently she was working on some designs that had to be displayed with much sensitivity and attention to detail. She continued to talk about her designs and about fashion without any evident reason to do so, then suddenly asked my name. She said she had heard it mentioned and wondered if by any chance I was the window artist whose designs were appearing in the society pages of her favorite newspaper. Had I any specific ideas for the displaying of gloves? Through the door I could see that her mother had ended her speech and was moving toward the cloakroom. The other woman quickly scrawled an address on a piece of paper and slipped silently away. I left soon after. At the indicated address, a hotel, I was taken to a suite of rooms by a bellboy. The door had been unlocked, and sitting in an armchair against which leaned a rubber-tipped cane was a graying man of about 60. He introduced himself as G. de M. and said he was the husband of the woman I had met. He was involved in the clothing industry also, for his family had controlled the crinoline market for over 50 years. Years ago, he had been taken by a severe infection and now had trouble walking. Trembling slightly, he grasped the arms of his chair and pulled himself eagerly forward to talk. Painting, sculpting, and clay have filled some gaps, he said. Though I was never to see his sculpture, he continued to refer to it. She's always the subject. He meant his wife, and I'm trying to capture her beauty in a very static pose. His wife appeared for a moment in a black dressing gown. She had gathered her hair and fastened it with one long golden pin. She asked me to forgive her for her lateness and then disappeared. He and I were alone once more. I faced him in absolute silence. Soon he began to talk again about the paintings, none of which I noticed, glancing around the room, were present. It seems there was a hopelessness about these studies that provoked a strange impatience about finishing them. Thus, few had been completed. Those that were finished radiated a sense of loss and of the past. He said that his wife had been most striking at the age of 16 and pointed to a framed photograph of her in a school uniform holding a shiny baton. The long, curved fingernails would have made it impossible to handle the instrument successfully. But my paintings, he said. Though I mentioned other things, he kept coming back to them. They're curiously flawed, but they're meticulously executed. I imagined them and, for some reason, saw the body of the baton twirler, his wife at 16, thrust into contorted poses. I suppose my work is quite a personal thing, he kept saying, almost wincing. He gestured to the picture of his wife, between the two of us. Going on to speak of the great pleasure he took in all the arts, especially visual, he stated that they were the only thing that had never disappointed him. He did not believe that art had any transcendent powers. Oh, it's just a way of passing the time. Soon there were strange lapses of attention. He began to doze. I sat for many moments not knowing what to do but to watch the sleeping figure. Then his wife reappeared, wearing a different outfit that I don't find necessary to describe. She glanced at her husband and suggested she and I move into another room to work. The room was both a studio and bedroom, but unlike one I'd ever seen. Underneath the slanting skylight, the walls had been painted an aggressive saffron, lending color to the more discreet, pearl-colored satin spread that covered the bed in one corner. Nothing else marred these orangey-yellow walls in that half of the room, except an oversized, gilt-framed mirror. The other end of the room was her studio. I'd more than expected to see work in progress tacked all over the walls, but the only sign of it was a pedestal holding an oversized ceramic arm, perhaps 3 times the size of a normal woman's. It was perfectly covered by an emerald kid glove that reached past the elbow, and halfway up its forearm was a heavy, barbaric-looking bracelet of brass and emerald. Employing the model of oversized proportions helped her to work with details and create a better equilibrium between the fingers, palm, and wrist of the model, as she explained. With only this one large sample to show, the enormous room dwarfed the drafting table, whose stool she had mounted. Above her, a crystal chandelier, more appropriate for a drawing room and sending shards of light off the long golden pin in her hair. She pulled some designs from a large portfolio and spread them on the floor. Clutching a pencil in a thin hand, half obscured by her large ring, she began speaking in a husky voice, first about the gloves, which were of every variety, and soon about herself. Because there were not often many guests in her home, it was pleasant to have someone to chat with. She continually referred to her relationship with her husband and the problem of his infirmity. She seemed oblivious to the fact that I did not wish her to do so. There were difficulties, she tried to explain, owing to the large difference in age, and his infirmity forced her to be independent. Since her name was identical to that mentioned in a poem by Rimbaud, H, I asked permission to refer to her by that single letter, but she could not resist embarrassing me by pointing out that the majority of critics had interpreted his puzzling text to be about masturbation. She heard his cane tapping in the other room and excused herself briskly but with charm, and I went home. A few days later she called. She had decided to contract me to display her gloves. She and her husband would expect me for dinner that evening, and afterwards we would discuss the designs in great detail. The call was complicated by a bad connection and obscured by other noises. I felt that I could hear the tapping of his cane and the sound of hair being brushed, or perhaps the friction of material sliding over the receiver. In casual tones, I asked what she was doing at the moment. "Well, I'm getting dressed for dinner," she explained. It was served on a veranda protected by glass. She was in good spirits and seemed happy to have someone whom he now termed one of his, quote, rare visits from a friend as a dinner guest. Both of them sat at the table, demonstrating a lack of interest in the food. He did this with the play of a fork in a small saucer of pâté. H traced the rim of a glass with the inside of an index finger, without bothering to drink its contents. G de M's hunger seemed replaced by an excessive joviality. It animated his tired features and, though genuine, seemed to be taxing his body to an intolerable degree. Grasping the edge of the table, breathing rapidly, and punctuating his words by shaking his cane, he spoke enthusiastically about current ideas in fashion, but also about today's youth. They could be the only ones who could prevent my most profound dreams from becoming a reality, because they have lost an interest in the extremities of beauty. Without knowing why, I spoke politely of my mother, even my depth of feeling for her. Soon I was confiding that she probably wasn't as lone as I had thought. Although there were visitors, they arrived after I had been put to bed. My father, she said, was supposed to have been French, as was, I suppose, G to M. Suddenly my words sounded trivial to my own ears. How silly we are when we are young, G to M gently interrupted. We always think there's no one like us.